The bullet struck the weathered post behind Wyatt Osborne's head, missing him by a finger's width, but the rancher didn't flinch. Death had been courting him since Clara passed, and some days, like today, he almost welcomed its cold embrace. The dusty main street of Sacramento, California stretched before him like the barren years ahead, empty of promise in the autumn of 1872. "You're a dead man walking, Osborne," shouted Harlan Jenkins, the banker's son who'd fired the shot, whiskey courage making his hand unsteady. "That land belongs to my father now." Wyatt merely stared back, eyes the color of winter sky but with none of its life. At 42, his face was etched with lines of grief that 3 years hadn't softened. The townsfolk who witnessed the confrontation held their breath, not out of concern for Wyatt's safety, but from the eerie calm that surrounded him. Sheriff Dale Perkins pushed through the gathering crowd, his mustache twitching with annoyance. "Put that gun down, Jenkins, before you actually hit someone worth missing." He grabbed the young man's wrist. "And you, Wyatt, go on home. Don't need you inviting trouble." Home. The word echoed hollowly in Wyatt's mind as he mounted his chestnut gelding. The Diamondo Ranch hadn't been home since Clara's passing. It was just a place where silence lived now, where memories haunted every corner, and where the once thriving cattle operation barely sustained itself through his minimal efforts. The 10-mile ride passed in a blur of golden grass and oak-dotted hills. When the familiar arch of the Diamond O came into view, Wyatt felt the weight on his shoulders grow heavier. The ranch house stood solid against the backdrop of the Sierra foothills, a 2-story testament to dreams he'd once held. Clara had designed it herself, planning for children they'd never had. His foreman, Miguel Reyes, was waiting by the barn, concern etched on his weathered face. "Another run-in with the Jenkins boy," Wyatt dismounted, passing the reins to Miguel. "Nothing worth talking about. The cattle in the north pasture need moving tomorrow," Miguel said, following Wyatt toward the house. "And Garrett's been asking about the horse auction in Stockton next week." "Handle it however you see fit," Wyatt replied, the same response he'd given to every ranch decision since the fever had taken Clara. He paused at the porch steps. "I'm turning in early." Miguel's sigh followed him inside. Both men knew early meant Wyatt would sit in Clara's rocking chair until dawn with a bottle of whiskey, as he'd done nearly every night since the funeral. Inside, dust motes danced in the late afternoon light streaming through windows that hadn't been properly cleaned in years. Clara's piano sat in the corner of the main room, its surface dulled with neglect. She'd played it every evening, her voice lifting through the ranch as the day's work ended, drawing men from the bunkhouse and corrals just to listen. Now the only sounds were Wyatt's boots on the wooden floor and the occasional creak of the house settling. He poured himself 3 fingers of whiskey and sank into the rocker, letting the burn of alcohol momentarily distract from the pain of existence. Morning came harsh and unwelcome. Wyatt woke slumped in the chair, neck stiff and mouth dry. The knock at the door that had roused him came again, more insistent. Miguel stood there, hat in hand. "Riders coming, 4 of them, thought you should know." Wyatt nodded, running a hand over his stubbled jaw. "I'll be out." After splashing water on his face and changing his shirt, he stepped onto the porch, squinting against the brightness. 4 riders approached the main house, dust billowing behind them. 3 men and what appeared to be a woman, though Wyatt couldn't be sure at this distance. He descended the steps, hand resting near the colt on his hip more from habit than intention. As they drew closer, he recognized Jack Edwards, a cattle buyer from Sacramento who'd done business with the ranch in better days. "Wyatt Osborne," Edwards called out, raising his hand in greeting. "Been a spell since I've seen the Diamondo." "Edwards," Wyatt acknowledged, nodding to the others as they dismounted, 2 men he didn't recognize and a woman who remained slightly behind them. "This here's Caleb Wilson and Tom Rickert," Edwards said, gesturing to the men. "And Miss Charlotte Evans." The woman stepped forward then, removing her riding hat to reveal copper-colored hair pinned loosely at her nape. She was younger than Wyatt had expected, perhaps 30, with clear green eyes that met his directly. "Mr. Osborne," she said, extending a gloved hand. "Thank you for receiving us, though I understand we've arrived unannounced." Her voice carried a slight musical quality, an Eastern refinement that seemed out of place in the California foothills. Wyatt shook her hand briefly, feeling oddly self-conscious about his disheveled appearance. "What brings you to the Diamond O?" he asked, addressing Edwards rather than meeting those disconcertingly direct green eyes again. "Business proposition," Edwards replied. "Miss Evans here is looking to purchase horses for her father's shipping company. Premium stock for officers and such. I told her you've got the best horseflesh in the county despite..." He trailed off, realizing his misstep. "Despite my recent lack of interest in maintaining it," Wyatt finished flatly. "The horses we have are working stock, not fancy parade mounts." Charlotte Evans stepped forward again. "Mr. Osborne, I've heard otherwise. Jack speaks highly of your breeding program, particularly your quarter horses, if I might see them." Something about her forthright manner made refusal difficult. Wyatt nodded curtly. "Miguel will show you the stock. I have business in town." He had no business in town, but the prospect of spending the day with strangers, especially a woman who stirred uncomfortable memories with her confident presence, was more than he could bear. Charlotte's expression cooled slightly. "I understand. Perhaps another time then. We've taken rooms at the Sacramento Hotel and will remain for a week." She turned to Miguel. "If Mr. Reyes is willing, we'd appreciate seeing what's available." Miguel glanced at Wyatt, who gave a short nod before turning toward the barn. Behind him, he heard Charlotte's voice again, speaking to the foreman, but he pushed it from his mind as he saddled his horse. The Diamond O could use the money from a good horse sale, but he'd leave the details to Miguel, as he had with everything else. Later that evening, after a solitary meal in a Sacramento cafe where he spoke to no one and no one approached him, Wyatt found himself reluctantly returning to the ranch. The sun was setting, painting the hills in gold and shadow as he approached the Diamond O arch. The sound reached him before he saw its source, a woman's voice, clear and strong, singing an old folk song that Clara had loved. For a disorienting moment, grief and memory collided, and Wyatt pulled his horse to a stop, his heart pounding painfully in his chest. The song came from the direction of the corrals. Nudging his mount forward, Wyatt rounded the barn to find Charlotte Evans perched on the top rail of the round pen. Inside, one of his best mares circled, her movements flowing with the rhythm of Charlotte's song. Miguel and the other ranch hands stood nearby, their expressions a mixture of wonder and nostalgia. No one noticed Wyatt at first, giving him a moment to observe the scene. Charlotte's singing wasn't operatic or showy, but had a pure, clear quality that carried across the ranch yard. The mare, normally skittish with strangers, moved with relaxed attentiveness, ears flicking toward the woman on the fence. When the song ended, the spell broke. One of the hands spotted Wyatt and nudged Miguel, who straightened and turned. "Mr. Osborne," Charlotte acknowledged, seemingly unsurprised by his appearance. "I hope you don't mind. This mare was a bit nervous and sometimes singing helps settle them." "She hasn't been worked much lately," Wyatt said, dismounting. "None of them have." "They're magnificent animals nonetheless," Charlotte replied, climbing down from the fence with easy grace. "Mr. Reyes has shown me several that would suit our needs perfectly." Miguel stepped forward. "Miss Evans has an eye for horseflesh, patron." She spotted Bella's potential right away, even with the mare being green. Wyatt said nothing, watching as Charlotte approached his horse and offered her palm for the animal to sniff. The gelding, usually standoffish with strangers, lowered his head to investigate. "You have a way with them," Wyatt observed reluctantly. "My father raised horses in Virginia before the war," she explained. "I grew up in the stables." A shadow crossed her face. "We lost everything when the fighting came through. He rebuilt the shipping business in San Francisco afterward, but I miss the horses. This is the first stock I've been authorized to purchase for the company." Something in her expression, a familiar grief carefully controlled, made Wyatt uncomfortable. He cleared his throat. "Miguel can handle the sale details. You're welcome to return tomorrow to make your selections." "Thank you," she said, those direct green eyes finding his again. "I'd like that very much." As she and her companions prepared to leave, Wyatt heard one of the ranch hands say quietly to another, "First time the place hasn't felt like a graveyard in 3 years." The words followed him into the empty house, echoing as he reached automatically for the whiskey bottle. He paused, hand hovering over the glass. The sound of Charlotte's singing seemed to linger in the air, displacing some of the silence that had become his only companion. Wyatt left the whiskey untouched that night. True to her word, Charlotte returned the next morning, alone this time. She wore divided riding skirts and a practical jacket, her copper hair braided and pinned beneath a wide-brimmed hat. Wyatt found himself waiting on the porch, having risen earlier than usual, and to his own surprise, shaved. "Good morning, Mr. Osborne," she called, dismounting with practiced ease. "I hope I haven't arrived too early." "No," he replied, descending the steps. "Miguel's already at the Corrals." They walked side by side, an awkward silence between them until Charlotte spoke again. "Your ranch is beautiful. The setting reminds me somewhat of the Shenandoah Valley." "Clara, my wife, she chose the location," Wyatt said, the words emerging before he could stop them. It was the first time he'd spoken Clara's name aloud to a stranger in years. Charlotte nodded, her expression softening. She had a fine eye then. There's harmony here between what man has built and what God created. When they reached the Corrals, Miguel had already separated several horses for inspection. Charlotte approached each animal methodically, checking teeth, legs, and movement with professional expertise. Wyatt found himself watching her more than the horses, noting the confident way she handled each animal and the respectful manner in which she addressed his ranch hands. "The bay gelding and these 3 mares would suit our needs," she finally announced. "Would you be willing to sell all 4, Mr. Osborne?" The price she named was fair, generous even, considering the ranch's diminished reputation. Wyatt nodded agreement, and they settled on a delivery date the following week. Business concluded, Wyatt expected her to leave, but Charlotte lingered, her gaze drawn to a chestnut yearling watching them from a nearby paddock. "That one has potential," she observed. "Perfect conformation for distance riding." "Clara's last foal," Wyatt said quietly. "The mare died birthing him." Charlotte was silent for a moment. "What's his name?" "Doesn't have one. Just call him the Red Colt." She studied the yearling thoughtfully. "That's no proper name for such a fine animal." Wyatt found himself unexpectedly defensive, been a bit busy keeping the ranch afloat to worry about naming horses. "Of course," she said, not backing down from his sudden sharpness. "I meant no offense, only that names have power. They acknowledge existence potential." She met his eyes directly. "They honor memory." The words struck too close to everything he'd been avoiding. Wyatt turned away. "Miguel can finish here. I have matters to attend to." He strode back to the house, angry with himself for the overreaction and with her for stirring things better left settled. Behind him, he heard Charlotte resume discussing details with Miguel, her voice calm and businesslike again. That evening, Wyatt sat on the porch watching darkness gather over the land. No whiskey bottle accompanied him, the habit somehow disrupted by the day's events. In the distance, lanterns glowed in the bunkhouse windows, and the occasional burst of laughter drifted across the yard, another sound that had grown rare in recent years. Movement caught his eye, a figure walking from the barn toward the main house. Charlotte Evans, her silhouette unmistakable even in the fading light, Wyatt stood as she approached the porch steps. "Miss Evans, I thought you'd return to town." "I stayed to discuss transportation arrangements with Mr. Reyes," she explained. "We finished later than expected. I was hoping to borrow a lantern for the ride back." "It's nearly full dark," Wyatt observed. "The road to town can be treacherous at night." Charlotte shrugged slightly. "I've ridden in worse conditions." "No doubt, but it would be irresponsible to let you make that journey alone at this hour." The words surprised him as much as they seemed to surprise her. "We have a guest room. It's not been used in some time, but it's available." She hesitated, then nodded. "That's very kind, thank you." The awkwardness of having a guest, particularly a female one in the house he'd allowed to fall into disrepair, suddenly struck Wyatt. He led her inside, acutely aware of the dust on the furniture and the general air of neglect. "I'll have Miguel's wife bring fresh linens," he said, lighting additional lamps. "The kitchen has likely seen better days, but there should be coffee and something for breakfast tomorrow." Charlotte stood in the center of the main room, her gaze drawn to the piano in the corner. "Do you play, Mr. Osborne?" No, Clara did. "Every evening." She nodded, not asking the questions most visitors did about his wife's death or expressing the awkward sympathy he'd come to dread. Instead, she simply said, "Music brings life to a home." "It was kind of you to offer shelter for the night. I won't intrude on your evening further." After showing her to the guest room and ensuring she had what she needed, Wyatt retreated to the porch again. The night was clear. Stars scattered across the sky like the diamonds that had inspired the ranch's name when he and Clara first claimed this land. For the first time in years, he allowed himself to fully remember his wife, not just her absence, but her presence. The way she'd sung while working in the garden, how she'd insisted on helping with the spring branding despite the disapproval of neighboring ranchers' wives, her laughter when he'd complained about the piano being delivered up the muddy track that passed for a road back then. The memories ached, but differently than before. Like a broken bone finally beginning to knit, inside the house, a lamp still burned in the guest room window. Wyatt wondered what Charlotte Evans was thinking, alone in this house of ghosts, and found himself hoping she didn't find it as desolate as he now realized it had become. Morning brought the smell of coffee and the sound of movement in the kitchen. Wyatt, who'd fallen asleep in the rocker on the porch, woke with a start, momentarily disoriented by these unfamiliar domestic sounds. He entered to find Charlotte at the stove, hair neatly braided but still wearing yesterday's riding clothes. "I took the liberty," she said, gesturing to the coffee pot. "I hope you don't mind." "No," he replied, accepting the cup she offered, "though I should warn you that stove has a temperamental nature." "So I discovered," she said with a slight smile. "We reached an understanding eventually." The coffee was better than anything Wyatt had managed to produce in years. They drank in surprisingly comfortable silence until Charlotte spoke again. "I've been thinking about your yearling, the red colt. If you were to consider selling him, I'd be interested." Wyatt looked up sharply. "He's not for sale. Everything has a price, Mr. Osborne, even memories." "Not that one." The words came out harsher than he intended. Charlotte set down her cup. "I understand. He was your wife's last project, something precious she left behind." She met his gaze steadily. "But is neglect the way to honor that legacy?" Anger flared. "You know nothing about my wife or what honors her memory." "You're right," Charlotte said, her voice softening. "I don't. I only know that beautiful animals deserve to fulfill their potential, and from what I can see, that colt has exceptional promise. But he needs proper training, consistent handling." She paused. "Things you've admitted you haven't provided your stock in recent years." The truth of her words stung. The red colt had indeed been Clara's pride, the result of careful breeding decisions, and the bloodlines she'd insisted were worth the investment. She died before seeing him born. "I'm returning to town," Charlotte said, gathering her things. "Thank you for your hospitality, Mr. Osborne, and for agreeing to the sale of the other horses. I'll send word regarding transportation arrangements." Wyatt escorted her to where Miguel had her horse saddled and waiting. As she mounted, he found himself saying, "Prometheus." She looked down at him, puzzled. The red colt. Clara wanted to call him Prometheus after the titan who brought fire to mankind. Charlotte's expression softened. "A powerful name, it suits him." As she rode away, Wyatt stood watching until she disappeared from view. Then, instead of returning to the empty house, he walked to the paddock where the yearling grazed. "Prometheus," he said aloud, and the colt's head came up, ears pricked forward as if recognizing the name that had existed only in Wyatt's memory until now. The next few days passed with a restlessness Wyatt hadn't felt in years. He found himself in the corrals more often, observing the stock with a critical eye that had once been second nature. The ranch hands noticed the change, exchanging glances, but saying nothing as he began giving specific instructions again, instead of deferring all decisions to Miguel. On the fourth day after Charlotte's visit, Wyatt rode to town. He told himself it was to purchase supplies and check mail that had likely accumulated at the general store. The real reason, the possibility of encountering Charlotte Evans, remained unacknowledged even to himself. Sacramento had grown substantially since its gold rush beginnings. but the main street still held the familiar mix of saloons, merchants, and hotels catering to travelers and locals alike. Wyatt completed his errands efficiently, then found himself outside the Sacramento Hotel, hesitating. "Osborne," a voice called. Jack Edwards approached from across the street. "Just the man I was hoping to see. Miss Evans was asking after you." Wyatt felt an unexpected surge of something, not quite pleasure but a quickening of interest. "Business matter, I assume." Edwards gave him a knowing look. "Could be. She's having lunch at Parker's Cafe if you're inclined to find out." Parker's was a respectable establishment that catered to the town's more genteel visitors and prosperous citizens. Wyatt hesitated, aware of his workday clothes and the lingering wilderness of his appearance despite recent attempts at grooming. "Perhaps another time," he said, turning away. "She leaves day after tomorrow," Edwards called after him. Heading back to San Francisco, shamed to miss the opportunity. Wyatt continued walking, but the information settled uneasily. 2 days. The horses she'd purchased would be delivered after that, the transaction completed without further interaction. This should have been a relief, a return to the quiet existence he'd maintained these past 3 years. Instead, he found himself turning back toward Parker's Cafe. Charlotte sat alone at a corner table, a book open beside her plate. She looked up as the bell above the door announced his entrance, surprise and something warmer flashing across her face. "Mr. Osborne," she said as he approached her table. "What a pleasant surprise. Miss Evans," he acknowledged, suddenly uncertain why he'd sought her out. "Edwards mentioned you were here. I thought we might discuss the delivery arrangements." "Of course." She gestured to the chair opposite her. "Please join me." Wyatt sat, acutely aware of curious glances from other diners. His presence in such an establishment was unusual enough to draw attention, let alone sitting with an attractive, unaccompanied woman. "I've arranged for a driver and wagon to transport the horses," Charlotte said. "They should arrive at your ranch next Tuesday." "That's acceptable." Wyatt paused, then added, "The red colt Prometheus he's been worked with daily since your visit." Her eyes brightened with interest. "Has he? How is he responding?" "Well, he's intelligent, takes to the halter better than expected for one handled so little." "That's wonderful to hear." She hesitated, then asked, "May I ask what prompted this renewed interest?" Wyatt shifted uncomfortably. "You were right about one thing." "Neglect isn't a proper memorial." Charlotte's expression softened. "I spoke too boldly that morning. It wasn't my place." "No, but it needed saying." He looked directly at her for the first time. "Clara would have been the first to tell me so if she were here." They fell silent as the waitress approached to take Wyatt's order. After she left, Charlotte closed her book, marking her place with a ribbon. "What are you reading?" he asked, genuinely curious. "Walt Whitman, Leaves of Grass." She smiled slightly. "Not everyone's preference, but I find his observations on life compelling." "I am large, I contain multitudes," Wyatt quoted unexpectedly. Charlotte's eyes widened. "You know Whitman." Clara was fond of poetry. She read aloud in the evening sometimes when the weather kept us indoors. The memory came without the usual stabbing pain. "I never understood half of it, but some phrases stuck. The right words have a way of finding permanent homes in our minds," Charlotte said. "Like good music." "Like your singing," Wyatt said before he could stop himself. "The hands still talk about it. First time in years most of them stayed around after supper instead of heading to town." A faint blush colored her cheeks. "I didn't realize I had an audience beyond the horses." It reminded them of better days. He didn't add that it had done the same for him. Their conversation continued through the meal, moving from horses to books to Charlotte's background in Virginia and her father's shipping business. Wyatt found himself speaking more than he had in months, sharing stories of the ranch's early days and the challenges of building something from nothing in the aftermath of the gold rush. When they finally left the cafe, the sun was lowering toward the western hills. They walked together to where Wyatt's horse was hitched. "When do you return to San Francisco?" he asked, though Edwards had already told him. "Day after tomorrow. The stage leaves at noon." Wyatt nodded, an unfamiliar reluctance to end their conversation taking hold. "Perhaps." "Would you care to see Prometheus's progress before you leave? Tomorrow, if you're not otherwise engaged." The smile that lit her face caught him off guard with its warmth. I'd like that very much, Mr. Osborne. Wyatt, he said impulsively. If you're coming to my ranch again, you might as well use my given name. Wyatt, she repeated, and I'm Charlotte to my friends. Until tomorrow then, Charlotte. As he rode home, the shadows seemed less oppressive than usual, the silence less absolute. Somewhere between Sacramento and the Diamond, a realization formed. For the first time since Clara's death, he was looking forward to tomorrow. Charlotte arrived mid-morning, her approach announced by one of the hands well before she reached the main house. Wyatt had been up since dawn, directing ranch activities with an energy that had Miguel hiding smiles behind his hand. The señorita has been good medicine, the foreman observed as they watched her approach. Wyatt chose not to respond to the implication, but he couldn't deny the change in the ranch's atmosphere or in himself since Charlotte's arrival. The paralysis of grief that had held him captive seemed to be loosening its grip, allowing him to see beyond mere survival for the first time in years. Charlotte dismounted with a smile that warmed something long cold inside him. "Good morning. I hope I'm not interrupting your work." "Nothing that can't wait," Wyatt assured her. "Prometheus is in the round pen. Miguel's been working with him daily." They walked to the training area where the yearling now moved confidently on a lead line, responding to Miguel's gentle guidance. Charlotte watched with evident pleasure, commenting on the colt's progress and natural abilities. "He'll make a fine saddle horse in another year," she observed. "With the right handling, he'll get it," Wyatt said firmly. "I've hired 2 more hands specifically for training. The Diamond used to be known for quality horseflesh. No reason it can't be again." Charlotte's glance was approving. "Plans for the future, then?" "Beginning to form," he acknowledged. "It's been clarifying, having fresh eyes on the operation." After observing Prometheus's training session, they walked the property, Wyatt pointing out improvements he intended to make and Charlotte offering occasional suggestions based on her experience in Virginia. Her practical knowledge and genuine interest made the conversation flow easily, and he found himself outlining plans he hadn't consciously formed until speaking them aloud. They stopped at a ridge overlooking the entire ranch, the buildings nestled in the valley below like toys against the vast landscape. The early autumn breeze carried the scent of dry grass and the distant mountains. "It's magnificent," Charlotte said softly. "No wonder you fought to keep it, even through grief." Wyatt looked at the land he'd worked for 20 years, trying to see it through her eyes rather than through the veil of loss that had colored his vision for so long. "I wasn't fighting to keep it," he admitted. "Just couldn't summon the energy to let it go." Charlotte turned to face him, her expression serious. "And now, I'm remembering why we chose this place, why we built something here. Clara always said the Diamond wasn't just for us but for those who'd come after." He paused. "We never had children, but she believed the ranch itself was our legacy." "A worthy one," Charlotte said, "one I've neglected too long." The moment stretched between them, filled with unspoken understanding. Wyatt found himself studying the curve of her cheek, the way the sun brought out auburn highlights in her copper hair, the steadiness of her green gaze. "I leave tomorrow," she said, breaking the silence. "I know. Will you write? Let me know how Prometheus progresses." The request was practical, reasonable, a businesswoman's interest in quality stock, but something in her voice suggested more, an opening for connection beyond their brief acquaintance. "I will," Wyatt promised. They returned to the ranch house for a meal prepared by Miguel's wife, who had appeared that morning with suspicious timing and a determination to make the house presentable for the señorita's visit. The table had been cleared of dust and clutter, fresh flowers placed in a vase Clara had once treasured. As they ate, Charlotte asked about the piano in the corner, still untouched since Wyatt's last attempt to clean it weeks earlier. "Clara played beautifully," he said. "Brought the instrument from St. Louis on a steamboat and then by wagon. Cost a small fortune to transport, but she said music was as necessary as bread. She sounds like a remarkable woman." She was. Wyatt found he could say this now with something approaching peace. Strong-minded, fearless. Had to be to take on this wilderness with just dreams and determination. "You must miss her terribly." "Every day," he acknowledged. But recently, I've started remembering the life we shared, not just the loss of it. Charlotte's smile held understanding rather than pity. That's how they stay with us, I think, through living memory, not just grieving absence. After the meal, she insisted on seeing the piano more closely. Her fingers traced the dusty keys without pressing them, a gesture of respect for the instrument's silence. "May I?" she asked, looking to Wyatt for permission. He hesitated, then nodded, preparing himself for the pain of hearing music from those keys again. Charlotte sat and began to play, not a mournful tune as he'd feared, but a gentle, hopeful melody that filled the room with warmth. When she began to sing, her clear voice breathed life into the house in a way Wyatt had thought impossible. It wasn't Clara's music. It didn't try to be. It was something new, something that acknowledged the past but didn't dwell there. Like spring following winter, necessary and right in its own time, when she finished, Charlotte remained seated, hands resting lightly on the keys. "Thank you," she said quietly, "for allowing me to bring music back to your home." "Thank you," Wyatt replied, his voice rougher than usual, "for reminding me that silence isn't the only way to honor memory." The rest of the afternoon passed too quickly. As the sun began its descent, Charlotte reluctantly announced she needed to return to town to prepare for tomorrow's departure. Wyatt insisted on riding with her, unwilling to relinquish her company before necessary. They rode side by side, conversation flowing comfortably between subjects both light and serious. Charlotte spoke of her father's business in San Francisco and her role in expanding its operations. Wyatt shared stories of the ranch's early days, anecdotes he'd kept locked away with all other memories of happier times. At the edge of town, they slowed their horses, the inevitable parting at hand. "I'll have your horses delivered as arranged," Wyatt said, formal words masking the reluctance he felt. "I know they'll be exactly as promised," Charlotte replied. She hesitated, then added, "San Francisco isn't so very far from Sacramento. The railroad makes the journey quite manageable these days." "It doesn't," Wyatt agreed, hope stirring unexpectedly, "and correspondence between the two is regular and reliable." "So I've heard." Charlotte smiled at his intentional understatement. "I would welcome letters beyond those regarding Prometheus's training, should you feel inclined to write them." "I believe I would," Wyatt said, returning her smile with one of his own, an expression that felt unfamiliar after so long. They parted with the promise of letters and the unspoken possibility of future meetings. As Wyatt rode back to the Diamond O, the setting sun painted the landscape in colors more vibrant than he'd noticed in years. The ranch no longer seemed like a monument to loss, but rather a living entity capable of change and renewal. In the corrals, men worked with the horses, their voices carrying on the evening air. From the bunkhouse, someone played a harmonica, the sound drifting across the yard like a welcome. For the first time since Clara's death, Wyatt felt the stirring of something beyond grief, not happiness yet, but the possibility of it. Like a dormant seed responding to spring rain, something long buried was beginning to awaken. He wrote the first letter that very night. Over the following months, correspondence between Sacramento and San Francisco flowed regularly. Charlotte's letters brought news of the horses she'd purchased, all performing admirably in their new roles, and vivid descriptions of city life that made Wyatt smile at her wry observations. His own letters detailed ranch improvements, Prometheus's development, and gradually, more personal reflections on his daily life and thoughts. Winter came and went, the rainy season bringing new growth to the land, and it seemed, to Wyatt himself. The Diamond O flourished under renewed leadership, its reputation for quality stock beginning to recover. The hands noted their boss's improved spirits, the way he joined them occasionally for evening meals, how the piano could sometimes be heard again in the main house when he practiced the simple tunes Charlotte had taught him during her brief visit. In early spring, a telegram arrived. Charlotte would be returning to Sacramento on business. The possibility of seeing her again accelerated Wyatt's heartbeat in a way that both alarmed and exhilarated him. He met her at the station, suddenly self-conscious in his best shirt and newly trimmed hair. The moment she stepped from the train, however, all awkwardness vanished. Her smile of genuine pleasure at seeing him again confirmed what their letters had suggested, that whatever connection had formed during her brief stay at the ranch had only strengthened in the months of correspondence. "The Diamond O has a booth at the county fair next week," he told her as they walked from the station. "First time in years we've participated. I thought, perhaps you'd like to attend, see how your investment has progressed." "I'd be delighted," Charlotte replied, "though I suspect my interest extends beyond mere investment at this point." The admission, simple as it was, shifted something between them, an acknowledgement of feelings that had been developing through ink and paper. The county fair brought people from throughout the region, the fairgrounds alive with competitions, exhibitions, and socializing. The Diamond O's display of horseflesh drew considerable attention, particularly the now nearly 2-year-old Prometheus, whose development had exceeded even Wyatt's hopes. Charlotte stood beside him as ranchers and townspeople alike commented on the quality of the stock and the ranch's evident resurgence. "You've accomplished so much," she said when they finally had a moment alone. "The change is remarkable." "Not just in the ranch," Wyatt admitted, watching a group of children race past with candy sticks. "Having a purpose again, it's been healing." "I'm glad," Charlotte said softly. "You deserve happiness, Wyatt." The simple statement touched him deeply. "So do you," he replied, reaching for her hand. She accepted the gesture, her fingers twining with his as naturally as if they'd done this 100 times before. They walked through the fair together, stopping to watch competitions and sample local food, their hands remaining linked more often than not. To observers, they might have appeared to be any couple enjoying the festivities, but Wyatt was acutely aware of the significance of each shared smile, each casual touch. That evening, as sunset painted the sky in shades of orange and pink, they sat on a blanket on a hillside overlooking the fairgrounds. Below them, lanterns began to glow as darkness gathered, and the distant sound of a fiddle floated up from the dancing area. "I return to San Francisco next week," Charlotte said, breaking a comfortable silence. "I know." Wyatt took a deep breath. "I've been thinking. The Diamond O could benefit from expanded business connections in San Francisco, direct sales to shipping companies, perhaps." Charlotte turned to look at him, a question in her eyes. "Indeed. Might require regular visits," he continued, "possibly extended stays." "That sounds like a sound business strategy," she said, her lips curving into a smile. "Though one wonders if business is the only motivation for such travels." "It is not," Wyatt admitted, reaching for her hand again. "Charlotte, these past months, your letters, your friendship, they've meant more to me than I can express. When you're here, the world seems brighter, more full of possibility." "I feel the same," she said, her voice gentle in the gathering darkness. "From that first day at your ranch, something about you called to me, not despite your grief, but perhaps because of the depth of feeling it represented. You loved completely, and that capacity for love didn't die with Clara." The mention of his wife's name didn't bring the usual pang of grief. Instead, Wyatt felt an odd sense of rightness, as if Clara herself would approve of this moment, this woman. "I never expected to feel this way again," he said. "Didn't think it was possible." "Yet here we are," Charlotte replied, "two people who have found each other against considerable odds." The music from below grew louder as more instruments joined the fiddle. Wyatt stood, pulling Charlotte gently to her feet. "Would you dance with me?" he asked. "Here under the stars, where there's no one to judge my rusty steps." Charlotte's laugh was warm in the cool evening air. "With pleasure." They danced on the hillside, moving to the distant music with more enthusiasm than grace. When Wyatt pulled her closer, Charlotte came willingly, her head resting against his shoulder as they swayed together. "I'm falling in love with you, Charlotte Evans," he said, the words emerging with surprising ease. "Have been since you sang to that mare and woke something in me I thought was gone forever." She looked up at him, moonlight silvering her features. "And I with you, Wyatt Osborne." A most unexpected and wonderful development. Their first kiss was gentle, exploratory, a promise of things to come rather than a culmination. When they parted, both were smiling, a shared joy that needed no words. In the weeks that followed, Wyatt made his first trip to San Francisco, experiencing the bustle and energy of the growing city through Charlotte's enthusiastic guidance. He met her father, a shrewd businessman with kind eyes who welcomed him warmly, and saw firsthand the shipping operation that had brought Charlotte to his ranch that fateful day. Their courtship progressed with the steady certainty of two people who had already revealed their true selves through months of letters. When Wyatt proposed during Charlotte's summer visit to the Diamond O, standing in the very corral where she had first sung to his horses, her acceptance was immediate and joyful. They were married in the fall, a ceremony that brought together Charlotte's city connections and Wyatt's ranching community. The Diamond O Ranch House, freshly painted and thoroughly renewed, hosted the celebration, its rooms filled with music and laughter for the first time in too long. That evening, after the guests had departed, Charlotte sat at Clara's piano, now tuned and polished to its former glory, and played a gentle melody. Wyatt stood nearby, watching his new wife with a heart full to bursting. "Clara would have liked you," he said when she finished. She always said music was the voice of the soul. Charlotte rose and came to him, taking his hands in hers. "Then I hope she knows that your soul is singing again, Wyatt. Different notes perhaps, but no less true. Because of you," he said, drawing her close. "You brought song back to the Diamond, oh, when I thought silence was all that remained." Outside, the ranch continued its evening rhythms, horses nickering in the corrals, hands gathering around the bunkhouse fire, the land settling into night under a canopy of stars. Inside, a new chapter began, built on respect for what had come before but focused firmly on the future stretching before them. The once quiet ranch now resonated with purpose and possibility, the melody of their shared life filling the spaces grief had hollowed out. Different from what had been, but beautiful in its own right, like Charlotte's song in the corrals that first day, unexpected but exactly what was needed to awaken a heart that had forgotten how to hope. In the years that followed, the Diamond O prospered under their joint stewardship. Charlotte's business acumen complemented Wyatt's ranching experience, expanding their operation beyond what either could have achieved alone. Prometheus grew into a champion stallion, his offspring carrying the Diamond O brand throughout California and beyond. And when their daughter was born 2 years later, a copper-haired girl with her mother's green eyes and her father's quiet determination, they named her Clara Elizabeth Osborne, a bridge between past and future, memory and hope. Life, like the seasons, had come full circle. The ranch that had grown quiet with grief now resonated with the sounds of family, work, and music, a testament to love's enduring power to heal and transform, to find new expressions without diminishing what came before. In the evenings, Charlotte still sang, her voice carrying across the corrals as day turned to dusk. And Wyatt listened, grateful beyond words for the woman who had taught him that the heart, like good land, could lie fallow but not forever barren, that with proper care and courage, new growth would always find its way toward the light.